pseudoscience.
Oh, man. That is a heavy word.
It really is. It's practically a verbal weapon at this point.
Oh, absolutely.
If you're in a debate and someone drops the P word on you, it's basically game over. It's just this total conversation stopper. We slap that label on anything that, maybe looks like science, smells like science, but according to the establishment, doesn't strictly follow the rules.
Right, like if there's no double-blind control study or you can't repeat it in a completely sterile lab, then boom, pseudoscience, next.
Exactly.
It's the ultimate academic dismissal. It effectively tells everyone, move along, folks. Nothing to see here. This isn't real. This isn't serious.
Yeah, it's a shutdown mechanism. But, and this is why I was so excited looking through this stack of sources we have for our deep dive today, it turns out that this hard line, this rigid border wall between real science and fake pseudoscience is actually a surprisingly modern invention.
It really is. If you zoom out on the timeline of human history, this boundary is just a blip. It's a completely recent construction.
Which brings us to our mission for this deep dive. Because we aren't here to argue about whether, crystals can heal your anxiety or if the Earth is flat.
Oh, please, let's definitely not go there.
No, we are doing something much deeper based on our sources. We are tracing the actual history of how we decided what is real and what isn't. We're going to look at how humanity separated meaning from matter.
And why that specific divorce might be the exact reason we're so bad at studying things like consciousness today. Or even anomalous things like UFOs.
Exactly. It's a fascinating trajectory that the source material lays out. We're talking about a timeline that goes from total unity in the ancient world to this really violent split during the scientific revolution. And now just maybe we're seeing a reunion of sorts.
It's a huge shift.
So let's jump right in. To understand the split, our sources say we really have to understand what came before it. We're talking pre-1500 CE, ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, India, China. The texts describe this era as the one system.
Right. And I think this is honestly the hardest part for our modern brains to grasp. Because today, we are just obsessed with categorization.
Oh, totally.
You go to a university today, and physics is in this shiny building, theology is across the street in an old brick building, and art is down the block.
And they do not talk to each other.
Never. They speak completely different languages.
They probably have entirely different funding sources, too.
Oh, without a doubt. But in the classical world, that distinction just didn't exist. It was all one giant system of knowing. If you were a scholar in ancient Greece, studying the stars, which we'd call astronomy, was the exact same pursuit as studying the meaning of those stars, which is astrology.
It wasn't separated.
Not at all.
Yeah.
And mathematics wasn't just for counting bricks or measuring land. It was considered sacred geometry.
Yeah.
It was deeply tied to the divine structure of reality itself.
So if you take someone like Pythagoras, right? We all know him for the theorem from high school math. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. We just think of him as a math guy.
Right, but to Pythagoras, numbers were spiritual entities. He didn't see any difference between the mathematical ratio of a plucked musical string and the actual harmony of the human soul. To him, it was all connected.
That's wild to think about. And medicine is another great example from the reading. Hippocrates, the father of medicine.
The Hippocratic Oath.
Yeah. He wouldn't just look at your physical symptoms. He'd look at the cosmos. He'd look at your spirit, the environment you lived in. The idea was that you couldn't fix the physical body without addressing the overall energy and meaning behind it.
And there's a line in the source material that really struck me regarding this. It completely reframes how we look at magic. Because when we hear words like alchemy or astrology today, we instantly think of Harry Potter.
We think of wizards in pointy hats.
Exactly. We think it's primitive superstition. We assume these were just ignorant people who didn't know any better yet.
Right, but the text argues that for the people actually doing it back then, it wasn't superstition at all. Astrology was essentially big data collection over thousands of years.
Yeah.
They were tracking these massive, complex patterns in the sky and then correlating them with societal or natural events on Earth. They were literally looking for the source code of the universe.
And alchemy is maybe even more misunderstood. It wasn't just a bunch of greedy people trying to turn lead into gold so they could get rich. The source actually defines it as protochemistry plus consciousness.
Plus consciousness. That's the key variable right there.
It is. An alchemist doing an experiment genuinely believed that their own internal state, their purity, their emotional focus, their spirit, actually affected the chemical reaction happening in the physical flask in front of them.
You couldn't separate the observer from the experiment.
Precisely. Knowledge was quantitative? Sure, they cared about weights and measures. but it was equally qualitative. It was deeply about meaning.
So for thousands of years, the world is whole. Mind and matter are just dancing together, and then the music stops.
The Great Divorce.
The scientific revolution. We're talking 16th and 17th centuries here. Now, the sources note that we usually tell this story as a massive triumph. The lights finally come on. Galileo, Descartes, Newton, they're the heroes who saved us from the Dark Ages.
And look, they were heroes. We really can't downplay that. They built the foundation of the entire modern world. But the texts point out that they achieved that rapid progress by making a very specific, aggressive trade-off. They introduced three massive shifts that basically changed the rules of reality.
Let's unpack those shifts for everyone listening. Shift number one is what the sources call measurement over meaning.
This became the new rule of the game. If you wanted to sit at the grown-up table of science, you had to bring things that could be physically measured, weighed, and quantified.
And if I bring something that involves, say, a deep feeling,
Yeah.
or a symbolic vision, or just a strong human intuition.
Trash. Subjective fluff. If you can't measure it with a physical ruler, it's not real. It was a move toward extreme literalism. Humanity stopped asking what things mean and started asking exclusively how much they weigh.
Which leads perfectly into the second shift. And honestly, reading this part, it feels like the exact moment the universe broke in half. The mind-matter split. This brings us to René Descartes.
Cartesian dualism. This is crucial to understand. And to get why he did this, you really have to remember the historical context of the time. The church was incredibly powerful.
They were actively burning people for heresy.
Exactly. Science desperately needed a way to exist and operate without its practitioners getting killed.
So it was a survival strategy.
It was essentially a peace treaty. Descartes took a philosophical cleaver to reality. He said, okay, the universe is composed of two entirely distinct substances. On one side, you have res extensa. That means extended things, matter, physical stuff, the human body, the planets.
And that side belongs to science.
Correct. Science gets total dominion over anything that physically takes up space, but then on the other side, you have res cogitans, thinking things, the mind, the soul, the spirit, consciousness itself.
And he basically just gave that side to the church.
That's exactly what he did. He handed the keys to the subjective realm to the church and said, look, you keep the soul and the meaning. We will just study the literal gears and pulleys of the material world. We won't touch the spiritual stuff at all.
It's brilliant politics when you think about it, but the major side effect was that consciousness was entirely evicted from science.
Completely exiled.
Wow.
Science became the study of dead stuff. The observer was totally removed from the equation. The universe became this giant, cold clockwork mechanism, and we were suddenly just ghosts haunting the machine.
And that leads directly to the third shift the sources identify, institutional power. Because eventually the state realizes that studying dead stuff is actually very, very useful.
It's incredibly useful. Think about it. If you can calculate the exact trajectory of a cannonball using Newtonian physics, you win the war.
Yeah.
If you can perfectly predict the tides for your naval fleet, you rule the seas. The state and industry completely fell in love with this new framework because it offered two things, prediction and control.
Whereas, meaning well, the state doesn't really care if you feel spiritually aligned with the stars on a Tuesday. They just care if your bridge stays up when the army marches across it.
Precisely. So funding, prestige, and institutional legitimacy all poured heavily into the material and control bucket. Anything that dealt with the uncontrollable, the mystical, the subjective, the highly anomalous was aggressively pushed into the shadows.
And this brings us to the 18th century, the Enlightenment. According to the text, this is the exact era where pseudoscience stops being just a descriptive category and starts becoming an actual insult.
This is the weaponization of language.
Yeah.
The definition of what constituted valid knowledge narrowed significantly. To be considered true, something had to be observable, material, repeatable by absolutely anyone, and this is the real kicker, independent of consciousness.
Independent of consciousness.
Meaning it should matter who is doing the experiment. A mindless robot should get the exact same result as a highly trained priest.
Which, to be fair, sounds fantastic if you're building a bridge. I definitely want my bridge built by strict math, not by a priest's internal feelings. But if you are trying to study the human mind...
It's a total disaster. And this is when terms like occult and superstition were just slapped onto entire fields of study. Astrology, alchemy, mysticism, they were all tossed in the bin. And here is the really fascinating nuance the source emphasizes. They weren't necessarily labeled pseudoscience because they were proven false.
That's a huge distinction for us to make. I think most people today just assume they were fully debunked by the scientific method.
But not initially. They were labeled pseudoscience because they violated the new rules. They dealt with res cogitans, the mind stuff. They dealt with non-ordinary perception. You couldn't measure an alchemist's spiritual purity with a ruler, so they were ejected from the stadium entirely.
It's like changing the rules of football overnight to say you can only use your feet and then permanently banning the goalkeeper because he's using his hands. He's not playing bad football, he's just playing by the old rules. But under the new framework, he's cheating.
That is a perfect analogy. The game changed to empiricism only, and anything that didn't neatly fit that incredibly narrow rule book was kicked out.
Now, I want to play devil's advocate for a second here because we have to be fair to the sources. I like antibiotics. I like that my phone's GPS works. I like that my toaster toasts bread. The Great Divorce definitely paid off in a lot of ways.
Oh, absolutely. We have to give credit where it's due, and the texts acknowledge this. By actively ignoring the soul and focusing entirely on matter, we became absolute wizards of the material world. Modern medicine, structural engineering, space travel, these are all the direct fruits of that divorce. We mastered the machine.
But there is a cost. You can't just amputate half of human reality without some serious consequences.
And the sources argue that the cost was astronomically high. We lost whole system thinking. We lost the cultural ability to understand purpose. And specifically, we created a massive, glaring blind spot for anything that behaves anomalously.
This is the part of the deep dive that really got me thinking, because the source material connects this 400-year-old history directly to things like UFOs, or what they call experiencer phenomena today.
Right. Think about the core of the scientific method. It heavily relies on repeatability. You need to be able to do the experiment on demand in a controlled lab setting over and over again. But what if the phenomenon you are trying to study is inherently rare? What if it's fleeting?
Or what if it's, as we discussed earlier, with alchemy intrinsically linked to consciousness itself?
Exactly. Take the experiencer phenomenon. These are people who claim to see UFOs or encounter non-human entities. These events are often highly personal. They are deeply context-dependent. They might only happen to someone once in an entire lifetime.
You can't just drag a UFO into a sterile clean room at MIT and say, okay, do the spooky light thing again, I have my clipboard ready.
You can't. And because you can't do that, strict materialism just throws its hands up and says, therefore, it didn't happen. The phenomenon becomes entirely invisible to institutional science. It's like if your only tool is a thermometer, you physically can't measure a dream, so you just conclude that dreams aren't real.
It reminds me of that old joke about the guy looking for his lost keys under the street lamp at night. Someone walks up and asks, hey, did you lose your keys right here? And he says, no, I lost them over in the dark park, but the light is much better over here.
That is exactly what modern science did according to this framework. We collectively decided to only look where the bright light of empiricism was shining. We only looked at the material, the repeatable, the predictable stuff. Everything else, the dark, the weird, the subjective mental stuff, we just actively ignored.
So we've essentially blinded ourselves to a huge chunk of reality. The rare, the subjective, the mental, all discarded just because our current toolkit is only built for the common, the objective, and the material.
We filter out all the data that doesn't fit our pre-existing model. We just call it noise and throw it away.
Yeah.
But the text asks a really vital question. What if that noise is actually the signal?
Which is a great segue to the most optimistic part of the sources we reviewed. The idea of reframing pseudoscience not as a trash heap of bad ideas, but as a frontier.
I love this reframe so much. The authors suggest we need to stop looking at pseudoscience as a failure of logic and start seeing it as a waiting room.
A waiting room for what, exactly?
For future science. History is literally littered with concepts that were aggressively mocked as pseudoscience right up until the exact moment we finally invented a technological tool to measure them.
The sources list some amazing historical examples of this. My absolute favorite has to be the rocks.
The meteorites. This is a true story, and it's so telling. In the 18th century, which is peak Enlightenment era, right when everyone was feeling very superior and perfectly rational, European peasants would come into town carrying these weird scourged rocks. And they'd say, hey, this fell from the sky. I literally saw it burning as it came down.
And the scientists of the day, the absolute experts, they just laughed at them.
They ruthlessly mocked them. The French Academy of Sciences, literally the smartest guys in the room at the time, issued an official statement saying that rocks cannot fall from the sky because there are no rocks in the sky. It sounds perfectly logical to them.
Sure, it's completely logical if you arrogantly assume you already know everything there is to know about the sky.
Exactly. So the very real testimony of the everyday observer was completely dismissed as peasant superstition. Thomas Jefferson even famously said something along the lines of, "I would rather believe that two Yankee professors would lie than believe that stones would fall from heaven." It was branded pure pseudoscience right up until we finally figured out the mechanics of the solar system.
Another massive one from the text is continental drift. This one is actually kind of tragic.
Alfred Wegener,
Yeah.
he was a researcher who looked at a world map and said, "Hey guys, South America and Africa look exactly like puzzle pieces. I think they used to fit together."
Which seems painfully obvious to any kindergartner looking at a globe today.
But the prominent geologists of his time absolutely destroyed his career. They said, "That's physically impossible. Continents are made of solid rock. Solid rock doesn't just float around. You're engaging in fantasy." He was completely humiliated by the establishment. He actually died in a blizzard in Greenland trying to find evidence for his theory, never knowing that he was actually right. It wasn't until the 1960s when we finally developed the tech to map the seafloor and understand plate tectonics that he was vindicated.
There are so many modern examples in the text, too. Neuroplasticity, the idea that the brain can change itself, that was career suicide to study a few decades ago.
Epigenetics, too, the observer effect in quantum mechanics. All of these were borderline or heavily dismissed concepts that are now totally mainstream science.
So the takeaway here is if you are a researcher working on the weird stuff today, whether that's consciousness studies, telepathy, UAP phenomena, and the establishment calls your work pseudoscience,
You should honestly take it as a badge of honor. You are operating at the edge of the map. The old map might say, "Here be dragons," over your field of study, but that's just because we haven't built the ships to survey those waters yet.
it's definitely bumpy off-road, but that is exactly where the actual discovery happens. And the source material heavily implies that we are actually seeing the pendulum start to swing back right now. The big reunion is starting.
We really are seeing it.
Yeah.
The strict res extensive materialism of Descartes is finally starting to crack under its own weight. You see it most obviously in quantum physics, where the observer fundamentally affects the state of the particle. But you also see it in emerging fields like systems biology and something the texts refer to as neurophenomenology.
Bless you.
It's quite a mouthful, but it's a brilliant field. It's basically asking the scientific community, what if subjective experience is real, actionable data? What if a person's internal feeling or perception is just as important to the equation as the external mathematical measurement?
It really feels like we are coming full circle as a species. Like we are finally waking up and realizing that Descartes' 400-year-old peace treaty with the church has officially expired.
It has expired. We are slowly realizing that to truly understand the universe, we have to put the mind back into the matter. We are actively trying to heal that historical divorce. We desperately need a science that is big enough and robust enough to handle both the physical atom and the subjective feeling of a human being looking at that atom.
So if we pull all this together for everyone listening, from the ancient unity of the one system through the really messy, violent divorce of the Enlightenment, all the way to this new frontier of consciousness studies, what is the ultimate takeaway?
I think the texts leave us with a deeply provocative question to consider. We have spent the last 4 centuries aggressively filtering reality through one very specific, very rigid lens. If I can't measure it, it's not real.
And the evidence suggests that filter might just be way too small for the actual universe we live in.
Exactly. So the question for you to mull over is this. If we finally stop dismissing subjective human experience as mere noise, and we start rigorously treating it as valid data, what other impossible things might suddenly become real? What incredible truths are currently just sitting in the pseudoscience waiting room, waiting for us to finally invent the right ruler?
That is definitely the question to chew on today. Don't be afraid of the edge of the map, folks. That's where all the fun stuff is hiding.
Stay curious out there.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll catch you on the next one.